Good morning, bonjour tout le monde. Merci de vous joindre à nous. Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Michel Dumoulin. I'm from the National Research Council of Canada. I'm a Vice President of Engineering within the NRC. Welcome to this panel. This panel is entitled Working Together to Boost the Clean Tech Industry to Reach Net Zero. I'm sure you'll agree, extremely timely, very important and critical for our society, our economy, our communities. Just quickly, I'll summarize the aim of the panel before we turn to our panelists. This panel this morning aims at exploring what is needed to grow the clean tech ecosystem in Canada with an in-depth look at all the players in the system. The panel will touch on developments that need to be considered in the regulatory and policy domains to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, including what is needed and already being done by and for SMEs, small and medium-sized companies, in the private sector to enable growth of clean tech companies across the country. We will also discuss the social science challenge related to deployment and implementation barriers to clean tech uptake. We also want to look at Indigenous inclusion in Canada's clean tech sector, and we'll also explore our collaboration among public sector R&D actors is strengthening the ecosystem in the areas of clean fuels, energy efficiency, and renewables. So again, welcome. It will be a very interesting panel. I'm sure we have a high quality panel. We've currently have 4 of them who have managed to join us. I'm expecting 2 more soon. Oh, there's one that I just see appearing. Good, very good timing. I was just about to say that a little while ago, we drew up a list of our ideal panel members, and luckily for the audience, they all accepted with enthusiasm, and that creates a bit of a challenge for me because now we have 6 panel members, and I have to make sure I have the honor, I have the privilege, but also challenging task of making sure that they all have a fair shake at providing us with their knowledge, wisdom, and advice. So without further ado, I will, well, first I should mention that we will have about 60 minutes of discussion with the panel that I will moderate, and then we will go to questions from the audience. So I invite all the attendees in the audience to please use the, I'm told that you should be able to find quickly, easily the question platform. So to type in your questions, make sure that you are, if possible, that'd be useful if you could indicate to which of the panelists you're directing your questions. And we will be taking, we'll have a 20-25 minutes towards the end for the questions from the audience. Okay, so without further ado, let's go to panel introduction. So I will ask each of the panel members to introduce themselves. So please state your name, your affiliation, your organization, your role within the organization, as well as what the organization does. And I'll do that by, I'll invite you to do this by alphabetical order of your first name. So we'll start with Ben. Ben, over to you.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here with the other panelists. My name is Ben Sparrow. I'm a clean tech entrepreneur and innovator. I started a company called Saltworks about 12 years ago in my East Vancouver apartment. It's now, I'm fortunate to work with really great people every day. We've grown substantially. We have substantial commercial production in Richmond, BC. Saltworks is an industrial desalination technology provider. Nasty, nasty saltwater. What does saltwater have to do with carbon? Well, in heavy industry and the waters they're now treating, it becomes very carbon intensive to do so. And then there was a question posed to us previously about our role. I also really hope and try to help add momentum to the sector. On a personal level, it's people development. There's tremendous talent coming out of our universities. Innovation and commercialization, and of course, advocating for the clean technology sector, believing that it is innovation that's going to help get us to the 2050 goals. Pleasure to be here.
Carolyn.
Fischer. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Ottawa and holder of the Canada 150 Research Chair in Climate Economics, Innovation, and Policy. So that gives you a little bit of sense of what I like to work on for my research. And as an economist, we like to think a lot about how we can use market-based solutions to promote sustainability outcomes. I'm sure we'll dive into that more later.
Excellent, thank you. Now we'll move to Jennifer.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. So I'm Jen Wagner, president of CarbonCure Technologies. So we're a Canadian clean tech company headquartered on the East Coast on a mission to reduce 500 million tons of CO2 per year by the year 2030. And we do that by offering a carbon removal solution to help the concrete industry decarbonize. We do that by collecting waste CO2 from industry and actually sequestering that into concrete, which improves both the concrete performance and also the sustainability. I'll talk a little bit more later about the details, but just to give you a sense for the sector, the cement and concrete industry represents about 8% of global emissions. So there's a pretty significant push to try to decarbonize the space. And we'll be building another New York City every month for the next 40 years. And most of that will be built with concrete. So that sort of frames up what we're all about and why we exist. So happy to be here.
Great, happy to have you. Excellent. Let's move to Michael.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Ross. I'm the Industrial Research Chair in Northern Energy Innovation at UConn University up in Whitehorse. Our research program is essentially funded 50% by the federal government through NSERC and 50% by the electric power utilities across all three territories. So that includes Yukon Energy Corporation, ATCO Electric Yukon, Northwest Territories Power Corporation, and Kulik Energy Corporation in Nunavut. And so our research program is directed by the utilities to pursue problems that are faced in the northern energy industry. And that includes integrating renewables into isolated diesel-based communities, diesel efficiencies, energy storage systems, demand-side management, and microgrid and smart grid control. In addition to working closely with the industry, we also have to work with communities, indigenous governments, economic development corporations to make sure projects work. The North is a small community, and we all have to partner together to make sure that these technologies are viable, accepted, and successful for the northern industry.
Excellent, thank you. And over to my colleague, Phil.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Phil DeLuna. I'm a director of the Materials for Clean Fuels Challenge program at the National Research Council of Canada. NRC is the Government of Canada's research and technology organization. We own and operate 22 national labs across the country and employ over 2,000 scientists and engineers to address the challenges of Canada through science and technology. My specific program has three main thrusts: CO2 conversion, clean hydrogen production, and artificial intelligence for materials discovery. And I like to consider myself like a research capitalist. So similar to how a venture capitalist tries to find the best startups in the world to invest in, and their return on investment is money, I try to find the best research and the best projects to invest in. And my return on investment is a potential GHG emission reduction. Happy to be here.
Excellent, great. I don't think Frank de Rosiers managed to connect with us. We're all familiar in these pandemic times that sometimes technology doesn't work in our way all the time. So hopefully Frank will be able to join us. But anyway, by now I'm sure the audience will agree with me. We have a great panel. As you can see, we have a diversified panel, highly qualified. We have representatives from government, industry, academia. And so I'm sure we'll have a great time. Now, let's start looking at, now I'm told that you should be able to, the audience can ask questions by using Q&A. There should be a Q&A button on your screen somewhere. Okay, now let's dive in with the first part of our discussions, the first question. I guess a nice little softball to start. I'd like to ask, kick us off with what is your vision of the future of clean technology in Canada? How do we get there, and what are the challenges? I'd like to start with Jennifer, if I may.
Thanks. Yeah, I think for us, really, there's a role everyone can play in getting to net zero. We're specifically approaching the cement and concrete industry, which represents a fairly significant portion of Canada's GHGs, and especially when you look globally, especially in countries like China. This is a problem that they've been tackling for decades. And the role that we play in helping that sector decarbonize is by introducing our carbon removal solution. And I've been kind of pleased to see how the space has evolved over the last couple of months, where the definitions are changing quite quickly. And so to meet our climate objectives, we need to do two things. We need to stop emitting so much, carbon reduction, but we also need to remove what's already been emitted. And that's what we're calling carbon removal. And we need both of those strategies in order to reach net zero. Fortunately, we actually do both with our technology. We prevent additional emissions from being emitted, but also consume those that have already been emitted. We've had quite a bit of traction to date. We've installed our technology, which is a retrofit, in about 300 plants, mostly in the US, seeing some growth here in Canada, but also over in Asia as well. And if you look at some of the recent reports, about 90% of the global utilization sites are CarbonCure installations. So that's really good for us as a business, but not so good for the climate. We need lots of solutions in this space. We can't do this alone. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how we can bring the sector further along collectively, because there is no silver bullet, and we need to have all shots on goal in order to meet our climate targets.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to hear on the same question, if I may, also from Carolyn and Ben. Perhaps, Carolyn, can I invite you to jump in at this point? Your vision of clean tech in Canada, and what are the challenges?
Thanks. And I really liked what Jennifer said, especially towards the end, that we really need all shots on goal. So we need to bring forth a lot of clean technologies, and we might not even know what those technologies look like or could be. So, I think the first thing that we need to do is level the playing field for clean technologies, and that means broadening and strengthening carbon pricing throughout Canada. And that has the benefit of not only giving incentives for reducing carbon emissions, using less emissions-intensive fuels, etc., but it also increases the profitability of clean alternatives, and so making it clean technologies look a lot more attractive to folks like Phil and others. So carbon pricing is a big component, not just of carbon mitigation, but also of promoting clean technologies, because it'll be hard for new technologies to compete with older, dirty ones if they don't have an environmental advantage. Of course, that's not to say that a carbon price alone is sufficient. There are also a lot of other barriers to developing and adopting and disseminating clean technology. So we do need to address those as well with targeted policies and with research support. But I guess the point I'd like to hammer home is that a carbon price is necessary, not necessarily sufficient, but necessary.
Great, thank you. Ben, you want to come in on this?
Sure. 2 words: innovation and regulation. And at the same time, that being, if it's done in Canada, understanding that Canada is a small domestic market, that we're looking at what the outside world needs outside of Canada, and then being able to export those solutions. I think this panel timing is very interesting considering what was released yesterday with the 2050 proposed regulations of these 5-year steps. And that's fantastic. Some may say that all of the core technologies exist today, but they're cost prohibitive. Yes, innovation will drive down costs of some of those core technologies. Innovation will bring new technologies online. And then regulation will allegedly fill the gaps in these 5-year chunks. The challenge is, at least in heavy industry, genuinely it takes 10 years to improve and get a technology to a commercial level, and then another 5 to 10 years to scale it up. So what does that mean? That means we need to be working on the right innovations now, today. And those every 5-year regulation tweaks may not be enough to get there unless we have the innovation portfolio available to us.
Good, thank you. Absolutely, you're bang on. I'd like to move to the second question on my list. And by now, the panelists have realized that I'll put you on the spot a little bit, but I'm happy if you want to wave at me, if you want to jump in and you feel strongly about if I just shout or send me a virtual kick in the shin if you want to attract my attention. I'll stay on the theme. I'd like to stay for a little more time on the theme of the vision, the overall vision and roadmap, but with a slightly different angle here. I'd like to discuss a little bit scale up and development. What are the key technologies that we need to focus on for scaling up and deployment to accelerate our efforts to meet the zero carbon emission targets? And for these technologies, what are the existing barriers preventing the uptake of these technologies? How can we overcome these barriers? May I start with Phil?
That's a great question. When it comes to decarbonizing and reaching net zero, I think first we have to think about what the sector by sector emissions are in Canada. We actually have a relatively clean electricity grid. We've outphased coal over time, and we have an abundance of hydroelectricity, especially in jurisdictions like Quebec and British Columbia. The areas where we still have a lot of work to go is oil and gas, petrochemical, and transportation sectors. Altogether, these account for about 60 to 70% of the CO2 emissions that we as a country emit. And so when I think about how do we get to net zero, I think about 3 steps. First is to have renewable electricity as much as we can. The second is to electrify everything that we possibly can. And the third is to address these hard to abate sectors where you can't use electrification alone. And in Canada, that makes up the brunt of where our CO2 emissions are. So the 2 technologies that I am not only supporting in my program, but I'm really interested and excited to see grow are CO2 capture, conversion, utilization, and storage, to the point that Jennifer made earlier about not only do we have to reduce, but we have to remove CO2. And then clean hydrogen production as a fuel for the future. And the reason I'm excited about both of these technologies is that they provide pathways to decarbonize industrial chemicals and industrial processes with which it is very difficult to find any solution you can electrify, and also to fuels to address the transportation sector and even long-term seasonal energy storage. So those are the 2 areas that I'm really looking forward to. And on the added benefit is that these technologies have a lot in common with the existing assets and infrastructures and skill sets that Canada already has at store. And we are world leaders when it comes to technology development in these 2 areas.
Michel, can I jump in on that too?
Thank you. Of course, please. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I spend all of my time thinking about what we do and sort of the space that we're in. So I'll have to let the others weigh in on sort of the more broad sweeping perspectives. But I want to echo what Phil said about the excitement around the CO2 capture, utilization, and storage, which are 3 different things, and they're all important, and they all play a role in getting to net zero. I think I've been really optimistic about how much excitement this space has drawn over the last 18 months. I can give a dozen examples of private and public initiatives and sort of organizations that have come to the table who we wouldn't have thought would be interested in this space. So just as an example, Stripe and Shopify. So they're e-commerce, like heavy tech, kind of big tech companies who you wouldn't think would be interested in this space, but they've actually invested quite heavily in carbon removal. And the mechanism that they're using to sort of grow the space is through carbon offsets, carbon credits. So they're actually paying companies to remove carbon from the air. And you wouldn't think that they would be a traditional buyer for that, but they see that this is a critical piece to getting to net zero, and they want to do what they can to inject additional capital into the space so that, as Ben said, those costs can be driven down over time, and we can bring these technologies to the mainstream so that we can sort of use them to their best potential. So it's not only about climate benefits, but it's also about an economic opportunity. These carbon utilization technologies can present, $1 trillion of new market opportunities. So it's not just about doing something good for the environment, it's about creating new business opportunities.
Correct, yes, significant interest. And I'm sorry Frank cannot be with us up to now, because NRCan, I'm sure you're aware, NRCan organized a workshop just 3 days ago on Tuesday on carbon capture and utilization, a very strong participation, very interesting debates. Okay, can I ask perhaps Ben to come in on this? What are the same questions, scaling up and deployment? What are the key technologies and then the barriers to these technologies for scale up?
Sure. 4 are on my list. Energy storage, driving down the cost of energy storage. No doubt the very important carbon cycle work, capture, sequestration, the work that Jennifer and her team are doing, that's absolutely critical. Another one, forest management. Living in British Columbia especially, it breaks my heart every time there's a forest fire. People do all of this fantastic work to sequester carbon, and then our forest goes up in flames. And coupled to that too, innovative protective forest ownership models, such we can protect and even possibly generate more carbon capture natural sinks. And the final one is maybe takes a bit more innovation, but biomimicry. So if we all stepped into a time machine and went back hundreds of millions of years, the atmosphere was carbon dioxide. It was Mother Nature who originally sequestered that carbon dioxide and generated the fossil fuels that we burned. It was Mother Nature that converted that atmosphere from CO2 to oxygen. So how can we use biomimicry to better sequester, capture carbon?
Interesting. And of course, forest management extremely timely this year with all the forest fires out in the West Coast. So it's quite daunting. Can I ask Michael to come in on this? What's your views from the academic world of the key technologies that are needed for scale up and deployment?
Well, I mean, I could be the first one to say that academia and practice are very, very different. Something that could work as an academic paper in theory works really well, but in practice doesn't. And some of the challenges that we face in the North are, like, realistically, nothing scales linearly. One example that we're looking at is small modular reactors, which they're trying to scale smaller, but it's difficult to do. I agree with the other panelists, and it's actually interesting to hear their background. One thing I'd like to add to Phil's comment in terms of our CO2 consumption, like what we need is heating in the North. That's a big utilization. Transportation is the first, but heating is arguably the second. But as far as scaling up and deployment, there was discussion before about a carbon tax, and there was a lot of Northerners who were against the carbon tax because despite a lot of Northerners being dependent on fossil fuels, there are no significant alternatives to point to. And so a carbon tax, it wouldn't change people's operation. If you have a diesel-based community and everything is all the energy is reliant on diesel, all that does is increase the cost of living to Northerners. So it's not, as Carolyn said, like it's a combined approach, and you have to take it as pricing, but also innovative technological solutions. And one thing I just want to give a quick example of some of the challenges that are difficult of deploying innovative technologies in the North is that you're taking some solutions that have been developed for southern jurisdictions and putting them in extreme environments that are isolated. So as an example, if you wanted to build something in Nunavut, oftentimes there are no cranes in the communities. And so, okay, you have to get the crane there. How are you going to do that? You have to do that by barge. Barge is only available once every 6 months. So that means that you have to, if you have a construction project that takes a month to construct, you're renting a crane for at the very least 6 months. And that's hopefully if you get there and come back and there are no issues. And if you have to fix it, you have to go back by barge. So there are challenges and difficulties with the logistics of implementing in the north. Nothing scales linearly, but with every challenge, there's an opportunity.
Absolutely. Can I just circle back to you directly on alternatives to diesel? We keep hearing about renewables like wind and solar. What about that? Is there potential? What are the barriers? Have you looked into this?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, there are many projects that are being pursued to implement renewables in remote communities. Actually, one of the main projects that our research group focuses on is how much renewables can we integrate into isolated diesel-based communities without affecting stability or reliability. And the biggest issue that a lot of utilities face is they cannot affect stability or reliability because a power outage in southern jurisdictions is an inconvenience. A power outage in a northern jurisdiction can get critical really, really fast. So they cannot compromise reliability. They not just the reliability of the equipment, but of the reliability of the whole system. But that being said, there are supplemental technologies that can assist in reducing diesel consumption, even at times operating diesel off. So for example, there's the Old Crow Solar project where they're implementing solar and battery storage system to operate diesel off at times in the summertime. There's the RV Clean Energy project, which is wind, solar, and batteries. The Lutzel K microgrid project is also looking at wind and solar and batteries. So there are options and opportunities, but say, for example, you have to worry about rime icing for the wind turbines. And if we have a motor that has seaweed on it, it won't work all that well. If you have wind turbine blades with icing on it, it won't spin all that well. The solar panels actually work better at colder temperatures, but the sun is never perfectly up in the sky. It rotates around. Even at even above the Arctic Circle, it kind of rotates around the horizon. So if you look at the design of the Old Crow Solar project, they have an east-west configuration for their solar panels. You'd think that you'd want to face it south, but that better meets the energy or the electricity need of the community because they don't have a midday peak. It's more flat. So it's more designing the system to solve the problems that the community has within the logistic environmental context of that community.
Oh, thank you. You've obviously looked into this. I'm glad to hear that. Excellent. That, in my notes, that concludes the initial part of the vision and roadmap barriers. Unless any of you want to touch on this before we move on to the next theme, I will be moving towards a theme of working together to meet objectives and creating communities around solutions, around these objectives and around finding solutions. And I'd like to start with, could some of you give examples of how organizations who have not traditionally worked together have actually collaborated in order to accelerate successfully clean tech deployment and adoption? Can I ask Jennifer to come in on this? Do you have examples of organizations who are not usually collaborating together have actually successfully done so?
I do, but I think Phil had his hand up. Just wondering if he wants to say something.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer.
Sorry, I missed that, Phil.
No, it's okay. I actually, on the goals and objectives, one of the things, I just want to make one small comment, which was really beautifully highlighted by what Michael had said, which is that there will be regional solutions and regional problems, and we need a whole toolkit of clean energy technologies that match the specific jurisdictions, not only technologies, but also policies. And so the idea of broad-based carbon taxing makes a lot of sense when you look at a macroeconomic view. But I actually had not thought of it from the Arctic lens until Michael had said that, and it really opened up my eyes to some of the inequalities that some of these communities may face. So that just highlights even further that what may work in Quebec may not work in Alberta, may not work in the Yukon, may not work in BC. And what we need is further communication between all jurisdictions and the ability to pick and choose which technologies and policies make the most sense in each of those locations.
Absolutely, so true. Absolutely, we need to. Oh, Michael, you want to come in, please?
Yeah, I agree with Phil, and I also wanted to mention that by no means am I saying that only Northerners can solve Northern problems. We are aware of the problems, but we don't have the capacity to solve them, and it's a win-win scenario if we could all work together to understand the context and solve the solution. So I completely agree with Phil.
Okay, thank you. I was just about to say that indeed we are moving away. We all know, I'll state the obvious. We're all globally moving away from a world where fossil fuels, oil was the solution to almost all our energy needs. We're moving away from that to a basket of options and a wide diversity of options, and that will have to be regional in nature to a large extent. And I've heard oftentimes about the specific challenges in the north, but it's only after you've gone there. It's only after I've been there and I've seen the diesel trucks just running around on a daily basis in the communities that can actually get the sense of the challenge, really. So it was a really eye-opener having the chance to go there. Okay, nobody's waving at me, so I think we're good. We'll be moving to the second theme. So the theme, as I started to mention, is about building communities, working in groups to meet the objectives. And I actually already, Jennifer got a good good few minutes to just start preparing, answering the question that I posed. So
I got a head start.
Yes, an excellent head start. So that's good. So I'm looking forward to a great answer.
Yeah, right. No pressure. Yeah, so I think, I mean, these are not simple problems to solve. I think you'd be hard pressed to find an example of a company who's been innovating and growing a clean tech company in a vacuum. I just don't see that happening. So for us, like looking back on our the last decade or so, whether it was in the early days, securing R&D funding, bringing in early investors, finding the first handful of partners, which is so critical to your long-term success. You have to find those mission-aligned organizations to partner with to get those early demos. It's not going to be perfect, so you really have to carefully select who you work with early on, and then you're crossing the chasm, and you're trying to find ways to scale as quickly as possible. So that could be, for us, we have established partnerships with other players in the supply chain to act as distributors for us in international markets. That's just one example. But I think you asked about non-traditional collaborations. I think if you think about collaborating across the supply chain, that's sort of, business as usual. But for us, I think this emerging interest from big tech companies in supporting the space of carbon removal has been something that we would not have expected to see. I mentioned the Stripe and Shopify examples. Just the other day, Stripe launched a new product they're calling Climate, and so they're a large payments processor. You never think they'd have anything to do with concrete, but they have a new functionality on their software that their users, so the small and medium businesses around the world who are using the Stripe platform, can opt in to support carbon removal technology growth. So now we're working with, someone who runs a bakery in London or someone who runs a shoe store in Japan. Those are non-traditional collaborations, but that can play a really critical role in scaling up carbon removal. So I'm really excited about working with, within the supply chain, but also with outside of it, because I think these are not solutions that you can solve alone.
Oh, we seem to have lost Michelle, so maybe I'll comment on this to fill the gap. And I'm going to take the moment now to maybe just plug selfishly my own group or my own program, which is all about collaborative research. And I think traditionally what you'll find in the innovation ecosystem is when you progress along the technology readiness levels from 1, which is really just an idea, to 10, which is implementation, that there are people and there are organizations that are really good at each of those pieces, and there's also gaps. So universities, for example, are amazing at pushing the edge of innovation and discovery at that low technology readiness level. And then SMEs are really great at trying to scale up from mid to high and et cetera. The biggest gap I see is that middle, the chasm you were mentioning, Jennifer, about taking something out of the lab and making it and putting it into either a prototype or to a pre-commercial scale. And I think that's where government and national labs really have a role to play, because we have the infrastructure. The idea around national labs and the government is that it is a neutral party with shared infrastructure built around collaboration that we can then leverage multiple people to help build partnership. And so I think an example of how organizations haven't traditionally worked together is often not only in the supply chain, but also within each of the different areas of innovation, whether that's an organization in academia, government, or industry. Traditionally, they've really worked within their own areas. And I think what you're seeing going forward, and I think my program is an example of that, is a combination of those 3 things addressing mission-oriented problems. And to me, that's very exciting. And great, Michel is here, so I can hand the floor back to him.
Okay, I'm glad to see that I'm back. So was I the only one who got kicked out? And okay, excellent. I'm glad. I was worried that everything was falling down. Good. Just for once, I'm glad to see that I was not that useful. I'm not. You can do it. You can do a good job without me. That's good. Nice to see. So I'm assuming you're still on the same question, and Jennifer has completed, and then Phil jumped in. Can I ask Michael to come in on this as well, perhaps?
Sure, I could give an example of I guess maybe not multidisciplinary collaboration, but traditionally with electric power systems, oftentimes it's the utility that does everything. There isn't a private company that's able to go in, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but as Ben was talking about with regulation, now people can connect to the electric power utility as independent power producers. So utilities don't have to borne the risk of technologies. It could be an independent power producer that could take on the risk, but could reap the benefits of that technology. In the Yukon, going back to the Old Crow Solar Project, the Wagner First Nation wanted to connect to their electric power system as an IPP, as an independent power producer, through their solar project. And so that was a partnership between ATCO Electric Yukon, Wagner First Nation, with also partnerships with Yukon University, Yukon government, the local solar installer, Solvest Incorporated, and as well as consultants, say, for example, Beyond Consulting. But a lot of the projects and how to make that successful, it is a balance of risk and regulation, where the regulation can dictate what can and can't be done. As an example, the community wanted to operate diesel off. They didn't like how the diesel was running 24/7, but the diesel is there to make sure that the voltage and frequency is set properly. And so without the diesel, the utility doesn't have control over that. But the community wanted to buy the battery to enable that to happen. So there are strategic ways and innovative strategies such that the community or the Wagner First Nation bought the utility the battery so that the utility can maintain that voltage and frequency regulation, but the partnership between the utility and the First Nation made it such that the utility will operate the battery to maximize the benefit of the solar project for the community. So it's more in terms of collaboration. This is sometimes regulation is restricting innovation, but regulation is there to mitigate risk. and it's a constant evolving balance of how to keep regulation matching the innovation while also minimizing the potential risk involved.
Good, excellent. Thank you so much. Good, very good example. Anybody wants to come in on this? Otherwise, I'll just keep moving along. The next question I have in my mind is similar but stretching. I'm trying to stretch the space a little bit. We talked about examples. I've asked you about examples where collaboration proved to be useful. Are there situations, applications, challenges where collaboration is a must, that without it you can't move forward? So it's a bit of a different angle on the same question of collaboration, cooperation. I'm thinking Carolyn or Jennifer. Carolyn, we have not heard from, I've let you aside for a little while. Can I put you on the spot a little bit here?
There are obviously certain sectors that are stickier and more challenging than others. I think Phil mentioned this, and this is certainly the view in Europe where I am now. You can see it's getting dark. That the EU has has ambitions to get to net zero by 2050, and all the the modeling indicates that to get there, basically the electricity sector has to be decarbonized in the next decade. But we're pretty confident that we know how to do that. Even the new technologies are already pretty conventional now. So there's definitely additional innovation to be made in addressing storage, and it's exciting to hear about these opportunities and challenges in northern communities, because I think there's also a lot of then potential global spillover. If we can solve those challenges, a lot of developing countries can benefit from cleaner microgrids, etc. But I think the stickier places are really industries, especially trade exposed industries, that those that have to compete on global markets. So like steel, for example, that's been a big one over the past 4 years, not even for climate purposes, but so that's where policy makers have to be creative in making sure to design regulations and incentives that give incentives to reduce emissions, but not in a way that that hampers industry's ability to make investments going forward. So that's I guess one of the benefits of a carbon price. A carbon price doesn't just raise costs; it also raises revenues. And then you have the opportunity to do a lot of things with those revenues. So one could be helping to compensate communities, northern communities that have a hard time reducing, or giving them funding, helping fund some of the technologies that they need, like the battery example that you gave. And another is using those revenues to to support clean investments in industries. So I think in the steel sector, and cement is another one. Jennifer, some great examples that some pretty big investments have to be made to switch to ultra low carbon technologies, and it's not going to be worth doing that unless they know that they're still going to have a market for their product afterwards. So that's why it's important to have the carbon cost incentive on the one hand, but also support for these investments and for these industries going forward.
Thank you. Jennifer, do you want to come in on this? I thought of you, but also Carolyn just hinted at what you're doing. So you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I actually really like this question. And again, I had the benefit of having a minute or two to think about it before I respond. But in any event, so we're a technology provider. Like we have the widget. It's completely useless if it doesn't get adopted by industry. So you can have the best technology in the world, but if nobody uses it, there's no benefit whatsoever to anyone. So we need industry to join us in this journey. And so for us, looking back, you know, like most, you know, heavy industry, they're a conservative bunch. Most organizations don't want to be first to try something new. So I think having incentives in place for early adopters to demonstrate the technology in the early days is really important. And that could be incentives that the technology provider provides. Maybe it's, you know, free or near free or some kind of advantage to being first or second, but also government. There's a couple of examples where the province of Alberta and the province of Ontario are really prioritizing utilization. And so they put in place incentives for local producers to try out new technologies like ours. So that was really important. And I also like this question because it really depends on how you frame the problem. So where's collaboration a must? Like, it makes you think about sort of what you're actually trying to achieve. Like CarbonCure, we're not satisfied with just having 300 customers. There's 100,000 in the world and we want them all. So if that's our end goal, how do we get there? And I think government plays a critical role in forcing that sort of sector-wide complete transformation to get to our climate targets. So there's a lot of things that government can do. And if anybody wants to dig into the details, you can go to our website and there's a policy page that outlines what government can do to help advance clean technologies that are ready to scale, like CarbonCures. So that could be, you know, easing policies that are overly restrictive to adopting low carbon technologies, because most of the codes and standards are written for, you know, the situation 10, 20 years ago. Things have changed. So sometimes modifications need to be considered. Also requiring environmental reporting on procurement of new projects. So there's something called environmental product declarations, EPDs. And there's a growing number of states and cities that are requiring, mostly in the US, that new projects present these so that there's a level playing field for product selection based on carbon footprint. And then there's also some really interesting examples of other states and cities, again, mostly in the US, that have introduced incentives for greener concrete that's made with CO2. So there's a bill in the New York State right now. There's an example of a city in Hawaii that did this, and then also the Conference of Mayors, which represents 1,400 cities, have also committed that they will consider incentivizing greener concrete made with CO2 on public projects. So those are examples of government playing, you know, taking a step forward and saying, we really want this and we want that wholesale change across the sector. So there's definitely a role that private sector can play, but government needs to play a role as well.
Well, that 1 minute that you had was really fruitful, was a great answer. Yes. Phil, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think another area that I'd like to talk about that can contribute is the finance sector. And so what I'm really excited about is you're seeing more and more of large asset owners, large pension funds, and lots of thought leaders in the finance sector looking at sustainable finance as a way to incentivize and bring capital into the markets for cleaner and greener technologies and decarbonization. And I'll give you the example of the Task Force for Climate Disclosure, which is a framework that allows and asks for a private industry to disclose what their climate risks are. You can't manage what you don't measure. And so how can we start using some of these tools? It may sound funny, but you know, these tools that accountants have developed to try and move that towards looking at climate risk and mitigation. And if we price in the risks involved with climate that many of these large assets, which are amortized to decades in the future, will face, then hopefully that will incentivize people who make decisions around deployment of capital to choose technologies or solutions or products that have a lower climate risk in the future.
Good point. Excellent point. I'd like at this point just to quickly remind, I'm keeping an eye on the questions from the audience. I see questions coming in, so that's excellent. Just in case some of the audience joined late, you have a Q&A button on your screen. Please use it to send us more questions. So there are excellent questions. Before we move to the questions from the audience, I'd like just to tease out again perhaps the actions. We've heard quite a number of actions in terms of regulation, incentives from various sectors. I'd like to make sure that we tease out all the possible actions. Particularly, we heard a little bit from Michael about the actions in the north with First Nations, and are there any other actions that you can think of that the various actors should or must take, particularly in general, but also particularly just in terms of ensuring that First Nations, Indigenous peoples can get to reap the benefits of the clean tech sector? I was going to ask Michael, but I see Ben waving, so let's start with Ben.
Hi there. Government has been doing a fantastic job at funding innovation in the past. One thing that we do not have, we have a 2050 plan, but we do not have a 2050 climate fund. A 30-year fund, a fund that has a long-term view. As innovators, when we finance things, you're often on a short-term view, one, because of investors, and then two, because of the government fiscal year. And so it makes it challenging to take that long-term view. I think Phil made a massively important point about how the investment sector is stepping up, and it echoes what Jennifer's saying. We have seen non-traditional approach driven in our sector, largely thanks to the Church of England, of all things. A major pension fund in the mining sector that's asking tough questions now. And in particular, Jennifer's point about heavy industry, that's the big gap, is heavy industry genuinely stepping up and being incentivized or regulated to do so. I think that's a massive gap that we could fill if we took a longer view, if we had a 2050 fund, if we had longer view on the regulations, then hopefully we'd see more acceleration of scale up.
Excellent, thank you. Can I turn to Michael? Any other actions that any actor should take, particularly to address the situation of vulnerable populations, ensuring benefits for all?
Yeah, I would say to that, you really have to really take into account of what their values are and what is actually meaningful to them. So for example, if you have a specific mandate, you have a specific objective, and your engagement is reach out, let them know what it is. But if it doesn't line up with your objective, doesn't matter, you're going your own way. You have to be able to listen. I think that that's the biggest action item is to listen and hear what they have to say. And the second thing is to be prepared to change your mission, your objectives to meet their needs and what they want, because that's effectively, that's how you could help with empowering them for acting in their best interest. Because if there is a conflict and you just keep on going on, that's not proper. That's taking advantage of a vulnerable population, kind of a check mark to say, yes, we have engagement, we've done our outreach. But if you're able to listen, and if you're willing to change or modify your approach so that it also accounts for the best interest of the community, you could go into a community and the First Nations government will say, we don't want this. Instead of fighting that and say, try and sell that technology, understand why, listen to them, and sort of incorporate, maybe your solution doesn't work the best. Maybe your approach isn't the best. But if you really value empowering vulnerable populations, you will include them in the discussion. And as experts, we have the ability to filter what information the community has. And sometimes the community has been fed a lot of misinformation in the past. And so just because there are salespeople that try and sell the golden key solution. I think Jennifer earlier on said it best, that there's no silver bullet, but there are a lot of people who want to sell to populations that have problems. They want to sell their own technology. And so there can be some misinformation that has been said. And in order to make sure that the information that you do convey is taken into consideration, you have to build that trusting relationship with the community, and that takes a lot of time. That takes a lot of effort, and building trust with anybody takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort. But as long as they could trust you, you could provide them with proper information so that they can make decisions on their own behalf.
Thank you. I see somebody wants to jump in. I think it's Jennifer, correct?
Yeah, I just want to say one really one quick point, which is when we talk about vulnerable populations, I think it's interesting what Michael was saying about sort of the upside of clean technology opportunities and making sure they have access to the technologies they want to also transition to a low carbon economy, but also considering minimizing the downside risks of climate change. So that makes me think about like environmental justice and how vulnerable populations tend to be the ones who bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change. Just as an example, so think of COVID, catastrophe, right? So if you look at New York City, I've been talking to some of my friends and colleagues down there, who's been able to leave and retreat to the Hamptons, the wealthy. So I think we need to consider the social impacts of climate change and how we can ensure that we're developing solutions and also protecting vulnerable populations.
Excellent, thank you. I'm keeping an eye on the question platform, and we're having great questions come in. So I'm tempted to turn to questions from the audience at this point. And I see two questions that deal with nuclear, that question the nuclear aspects. So I'll try to merge both, and just that'll give you a minute to think about who wants to step in and talk to the nuclear energy question. So one question goes like this: as someone outside the field, nuclear power seems to have great potential and the science is overall positive, but countries such as France are stepping away from nuclear. Is that because of public opinion or new science? Are we missing out on an essential tool? And the other question that's quite similar is, could nuclear energy micro-reactors help replace fossil fuel power generation facilities in isolated communities, especially in northern Canada? Okay, there you go. A basket of questions on nuclear. Who wants to take this? Who would like to? I'm not aware that nuclear is in any of your backgrounds. It might be a bit of a challenge. Anybody wants to take a stab? Yes, Michael.
So with regards to nuclear, actually, Kulik Energy Corporation is part of a consortium of groups that are looking at advancing small modular reactors, and they see that SMRs are one of the potential markets for small modular reactors are northern communities. There are challenges with the operation. For example, nuclear does operate on a steady load, so you can't ramp up or ramp down. Those who were in Ontario recognized, or if you follow the independent electricity system operator, you recognize that you can't ramp up or down nuclear very, very quickly. But in a remote community, you could see fluctuations as people, if the school goes online, you will see that on the profile of the system, if one school goes online. So that's one of the challenges, is balancing that out. Also, diesel generators are known technologies, whereas small modular reactors, it's how do you get people who are trained to maintain and operate that? Now, right now, the small modular reactor community is building the system to be kind of standalone, place it into a community, let it run for 20 years, and then take the whole thing out. And that's kind of what they're going towards. But there will be some challenges. No technology will require zero maintenance over 20-year lifespan. There will be challenges with that. But I would argue that, yeah, there is a social barrier. There was an outreach that the small modular reactor group did in Nunavut in 2018, I want to say. And that wasn't perceived well from the community because the fallout from Chernobyl is seen in the lichen that the caribou are eating in Nunavut, and the community sees that. And humans aren't great at evaluating risk. So say, for example, we have a fear of flying, but have no qualms about getting into a car, even though we're more likely to die in a car accident than in a plane accident. So part of it is social. Part of it is the technology isn't quite there. Right now, they're talking about systems, maybe 10 years from now, it'll be as small as 5 megawatts. Some of these systems have a peak load of 300 kilowatts. So less than a third of what the smallest anticipated small modular reactor will be designed for.
Excellent, thank you. Anybody else has views on nuclear energy for now? If not, I'll move on to the next. Again, I'll try to combine two questions. Not surprisingly, we have people interested in the interplay between the pandemic, the coronavirus, the COVID-19, and clean tech, our environment, global preservation. So I'll try to merge that in real time. So it's very important to hear about environment, global preservation, greenhouse effect, and a lot of arguments about human development, especially in developed countries. What has the pandemic showed us that can be useful in looking at the environment and moving forward? And there's another question that basically turns the question around: what can we learn from the pandemic towards helping us moving forward and dealing with the environment, the climate change crisis? And vice versa. How can the clean tech sector contribute to economic resilience and green recovery in the context of the pandemic? So two different angles, I guess, in the interplay between the pandemic and the environment and climate change crisis. Anybody wants to take that? Michael, then Carolyn.
Actually, I don't want to monopolize. I'll let Carolyn go first.
Oh, okay, sure.
Is that you don't actually have to travel and meet together to have an effective meeting. So I think virtual conferencing will change practices indefinitely. I mean, I still hope to be able to get together and see people, but the sort of need to waste resources on transport has obviously gone down. I think more broadly is that the the recession that has accompanied this pandemic is going to need a huge policy lift to get the economy back on track. But that's also a big opportunity to make sure the economy gets back on the right track. So if this is opportunity to invest in infrastructure, create jobs, but making sure that infrastructure is clean. So in creating the jobs for the future, not the jobs for yesterday. I think it's really also an opportunity to think about the kind of future that we want to create. We've had a big pause in our lives that have made us reevaluate a lot of aspects of our lives. And I think that's a great time to think going forward, well, what do we want the future to look like? Because we need to start building it now, not only, to clean our environment, but also to save our economy.
Excellent, thank you. Michael, you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention a quick parallel with, say, for example, the masks, the 3M masks, where we were importing them from the States despite us exporting the raw material to the States. And when the border was potentially closed, then I believe it was Doug Ford that wanted to build it locally, build everything. And there's a lot of parallels with that, with local sustainability with clean energy. solar and wind are both clean energy technologies that are locally sourced, and the revenues could feed into the local economy. So as we bounce back, like there's a lot of parallels between extreme situations, such as I'm going to go back to the northern example as well as COVID, but sustainability is, we're recognizing that the sustainability and resiliency of, if anything could happen, that we could bounce back from it. A lot of that has to do with clean energy that is locally sourced, funding local opportunities, but also taking advantage of global opportunities, because, I mean, once COVID ceases to exist, we could have a good balance of being self-sufficient as well as importing the complementary technologies to make our lives a lot better.
Good point. I think Phil wanted to come in as well. Yes, please, Phil.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that I found most interesting about the pandemic is it really showed the ability for the government to step into action in a big way. When we think about CERB and the mobilization of financing and getting money to citizens, when we think about the work that we did at the NRC, everything kind of stopped and everyone was all hands on deck on thinking about how to address this crisis. The call to industry, and when you think about all of the breweries and distilleries that started making hand sanitizer ethanol, right? It's incredible. I think we're in a moment right now in the second wave where COVID fatigue has set in, but we need to also remember the response and the unified response for the first few months that this happened, when a lot was unknown and the world sprung into action. And I think, can we use that and channel that inspiration and that sense of urgency to tackle other problems in the world, whether that's climate change, whether that's inequality, whether that's social safety nets, whatever it may be. And I like to think, imagine if we could mobilize government, industry, and the public sector, all of it, in a response to climate change, the same way that we responded to the pandemic. So that's something that I think now, whenever people say you can't do this, or the government's too slow, or whatever it is, and even within the government, if there are people in the public service who use that as an excuse for the way that things have always been done, I'll point to this time and I'll say, no, we can do better, we should do better, and we must do better if we want to address climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent point. And building on both, actually, yes, we saw quite a number. I had the privilege to see quite a number of entrepreneurs pivoting so quickly, particularly on the mass N95, and that within days switching over production to new products. It was amazing. And this is something we need to learn, that yes, people can pivot really quickly. Governments can take action, can take decisions. People get confined overnight. It's impressive. We should learn from this. Jennifer, you wanted to come in?
Yeah. So I'm glad you used the word pivot, and I think Carolyn used the word reevaluate. So for us, we, like everybody else, there was a period of over a couple of days where our world came kind of crashing down. We had people on planes. People scattered all around the world at job sites, and of course we sent them home. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that. My phone just rang. Prioritizing health and safety, getting people out of the air. But then we sort of thought, okay, the way we do things normally is we send engineers on planes, and they spend time with the customers and they install the equipment, and that's just the way it's done. And of course, we had to rethink and reevaluate virtually every aspect of how we sell, service, and expand across the world. So for us, this has actually been a really nice silver lining, where we now do all of the installations remotely. So we send the equipment in advance. We literally get on a Zoom call with our customers and then walk them through how to install the equipment. That required a bit of tweaking on the software and the hardware side, but for us, that's made a massive difference in the pace in which we can scale. So I think for companies who are waiting for things to return to normal, they're just going to get left behind. It's not going to happen. So I think to the extent that companies can pivot as quickly as possible, just figure out how to do business in the new world. And one of the things I'll say is COVID's made the world a lot smaller. So we can get, people on the phone a lot easier. We actually raised an entire new round of investment after the pandemic. So I think in April, we launched a fundraising campaign, and we're able to close that in the fall. So I think, pivoting right away, not waiting for things to turn normal, and also taking advantage of the fact that people are a little bit more accessible than they have been in the past.
Absolutely. Very, very, very true. I'll move to question from the audience. There's a question that's specifically directed at Ben, so I'm happy to see a question from the audience and directed directly to one of our panelist members. So the question is, what impact is the Saltworks technology having on water use in oil sands and the impact on oil sands production? Ben, over to you.
Sure, and I think my 15-month-old daughter wants to add to that answer. Sorry about the background noise. So Saltworks is not focused on the oil sands. All of our focus is largely on the US market, other sectors, yes, some oil and gas. And related to the pandemic question, something that we had started working on before the pandemic was increased diversification, and that very much helps. So fortunately, we were diversified. Oil and gas activity has gone away, and even prior to that, in the oil sands, we weren't doing much, and there's a whole pile of regulatory and cost reasons as to why. The sectors that we are working in, the sectors where we have pivoted, increasingly pivoted to where we are seeing growth are, and it's linked to the pandemic, pharma. Farmers scaling up, and they're finding that they can't meet their discharge requirements, so they need water treatment. Microelectronics, a lot of microelectronic companies are planning for factory extensions, and that's again impacting them. And the other one's lithium. So huge uptake in lithium. Now that's a forward-looking one. So, tying back into the pandemic, people mentioned pivot. It's absolutely critical. I found that, people will act together, but to other people's point, they grow fatigue. The long view is good. The long view is very positive. Short view, in some businesses, it's tough, right? Let's be honest. A lot of heavy industry has turtled in. It's tougher to get access to capital and to get access to their operating budgets. So diversification is key, and that's something, again, that we worked on early on, including diversifying away from the oil sands where we started. We'd love to do work there, but I'll be honest, we wasted a lot of time in the oil sands.
Okay, good, thank you. I'm asked by somebody from the audience to pass on the greetings from somebody from Brazil. Very appreciative of the quality of the panel. So somebody from Brazil is watching you, listening to you. That's good. A couple of questions that deal with the social aspect. So we're moving a little bit away from technology, financing. Somebody would like to hear your views on what are the traits you're looking for when collaborating internationally. So the ideal international partner, what kind of traits you're looking for? Ben, then Phil.
Above all, integrity and honesty. So there's different cultures out there. It's very easy to work in the US and Australia. They share common law, they share common business practices. But I'll be honest, in some countries, it's a little bit more mysterious. Smoke and mirrors talk can be cheaper, and that's been a challenge for us.
Okay, that's clear, direct. Thank you. Phil.
Yeah, so in my program, we actually have international collaborations with Germany, the UK, and with the United States. And I think this is true for not only international partnerships, but every partnership, which is, do you together sum up to more than each of you apart? Meaning, are you bringing something to the table, and is your partner bringing something to the table that complement each other, and together you can accomplish more than without each other? I think that oftentimes when you approach a partnership, if you're approaching a partnership for superficial reasons, where at the core of your value system or at the core of your value offering doesn't match up, or in other times are actually competitive with one another, that will be a failure, or a recipe for failure. So when approaching international partnerships, culture and integrity and honesty is very clear and key to that. I completely agree. And then underlying all of that is, what do you bring, what do they bring, and together do you bring more than apart?
Thank you. Excellent. Anybody wants to come in on this? Otherwise, I'll tackle another one. I'll present another one. Again, in the social realm. Oh, Carolyn, you want to come in?
Oh, I just wanted to say quickly that I like this question just as a reminder that, you know, Canada is not alone in trying to tackle the climate change problem. It's a global problem, and a lot of countries are going forward with very ambitious reduction targets and programs for technologies too. So I think this is an opportunity for Canada to get in the mix and collaborate and find also, you know, intergovernmental partners as well as you know, cross-country firms, but also a reminder that if Canada wants to stay competitive, we really need to double down on clean tech and innovation, because the rest of the world is going clean. We're not going to be going back to the same kind of world and demand for fossil energy that we've had in the past.
Absolutely, and then that's a nice segue into the next question. Actually, I'll try to merge two different questions that touch on the world international aspect and then social science, I guess. Someone is interested in hearing your thoughts on what are the risks related to worldviews, I guess geopolitics, different ways of operating in different countries, and social aspects in different jurisdictions. I've merged that. Hopefully this is something one of you or some of you can tackle or would like to tackle. The risks in operating internationally. Yes, Phil.
Yeah, so I'll preface this answer by saying these are the views of my own and not of my organization. But I think that we're seeing around the world more polarization in terms of our society and in terms of just the way that people are approaching problems, whether that's climate change, whether that's the pandemic. And I think at the root of this is a loss of true communication and empathy to one another. And we're seeing more and more disenfranchised people or people who feel that they've been left behind. And I think that when we talk about geopolitics and when we talk about international collaboration, we have to also recognize the realities on the ground of the places and the people that we're talking to. But also that underlying that is a current that as humans, we all want, and I truly believe that we all want and value the same thing. We want a better place for our children. We want safety and security for our loved ones. And we want the opportunity to prosper. I think that what we're seeing in this polarization is people are feeling that they're not getting those opportunities. So when we talk to people around the world, we have to be cognizant of what their realities are and what are the challenges and barriers they're facing to achieving these opportunities.
Excellent, thank you. Anybody else has views on this? Yes, Michael.
Not so much the international, but I could even give a context within the Canadian realm of different social aspects and risks in terms of worldviews. So one common worldview that First Nations have that, say, settlers don't, is that there's no such thing as owning land. Traditionally, there's no owning land, whereas I own my land on for my house. We all live in houses. You know, there's specific lands that are designated for that. That doesn't exist. And a parallel that someone explained to me that kind of brings it more into light is, what does it mean to own air? So we could own land, but what does it mean to own air? You can't breathe that because that's my air. That doesn't make sense. And so it's just different worldviews. But I think that Ben and Phil on a previous question discussed, I mean, what does a good collaboration mean? It's the same thing. It's trust, respect, empathy, and making sure that you are socially aware that there may be different value streams and different worldviews on things that you take for granted.
Very wise, very thoughtful. Thank you. I see in the question platform several questions. Several people would like to bring us back to carbon pricing and the interplay with regulations. I'll attempt to merge a few questions together, and I'll just throw 2 or 3 questions at you and see who wants to pick up the ball. What is the role of government procurement and or innovation policies in our emissions intensive trade exposed industries such as steel manufacturing? Another one related to this, how can these combine with regulations and carbon pricing? How best to purposefully grow our clean technology economy as we tackle this issue? And while you're thinking of wise, clever answers, I'll just throw another one in that's related. To fully take into account the externalities, costs of present and future climate change impacts of burning fossil fuels, can you comment on the pluses and minuses of using either carbon pricing or regulations? So different angles around regulations, carbon pricing, incentives, procurement, quite a basket of different questions. Who wants to come in? I'm tempted to put Carolyn on the spot since you brought up carbon pricing first, and that is revolving around carbon pricing. You have thoughts on this one, on this series of
sure. I always have thoughts on carbon pricing. So you know, the reason economists really like carbon pricing, at least as a central component of climate policy, is that it creates incentives. It creates market incentives for people to find, you know, whatever way is easiest and most cost effective to reduce their carbon emissions. So in general, compared to a regulation where you have to try to figure out what to tell, you know, each installation to do, it's a lot more cost effective and flexible for industry. So for firms that have, you know, opportunities to invest and reduce their emissions, they can do that and then save on carbon tax payments or on emission allowances. And those for whom, at least for the moment, it's expensive, they have the opportunity to comply by paying the fee, and then those revenues are available to invest or address other issues. So that's why we tend to like carbon pricing. However, you know, especially when we're talking about new and emerging technologies, it's often not enough. It's really important that it's there to generate some market return for having a clean alternative. I mean, if carbon isn't being priced, who is going to bother capturing and sequestering it? So that's important. You can have some niche markets. I'm excited to hear about some of Jennifer's examples of companies sort of voluntarily offering this option to consumers to help support these new technologies. And we have seen that in like renewable energy. So I've contracted for, you know, renewable electricity and clean gas and with offsets here. And so that's nice, but it's not enough. That tends to be, you know, there's sort of a niche group of consumers that are willing to do that, but it's not the whole market. So it is important to have some broad-based incentives in there to help ensure that these new technologies are going to have a market. Government procurement has a role, a similar market creating role to play, kind of like these niche consumers, but obviously government tends to be a much bigger consumer. So by setting standards for the products that, you know, so if you have to have green cement to build government buildings, that creates a market, that helps create a market to get this industry off the ground. In some places, you can think about procurement standards for natural gas. So you only buy natural gas from companies that engage in effective leak detection and repair. So there are definitely opportunities in procurement to sort of create markets, but ultimately the broadest incentive that you can think about is the carbon price.
Good, thank you. Anybody else wants to come in on this one? I see a little bit of movement on the platform, but these are mostly messages of compliments, appreciation, grateful. Oh, there's another question that just popped on. I'll take a moment. Okay, I'll just read it out loud. With more reports on high methane emissions being released into the air, how can we pivot quickly to incorporate this into our efforts toward net zero carbon emissions? Okay. Any thoughts on this? We are almost at time. We have just a couple of minutes. I see Carolyn wants to react to that one.
Well, I guess I raised the methane issue, and this, this is an area where, at least initially, some regulations are needed and effective for like emissions pricing to really work. You have to be able to monitor emissions correctly and measure them, and that's still, the part of the problem with methane is that we're not measuring all the leaks. And I think this is a really important issue to highlight, because if you look at where the opportunities are to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and gas sector, very little of it has to do with improving the efficiency of oil sands upgrading. There's like very little efficiency improvement that you can get that lowers the greenhouse gas footprint. A lot of it is actually upstream methane. So regulations and technologies and ultimately incentives, we're getting better at measuring through satellite data and other data. Potentially we could create some price incentives, procurement incentives for clean gas. And ultimately the other opportunities to reduce those emissions are having less downstream emissions. So that's switching towards cleaner fuels.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're almost at time, and I just got a note that Franck Desrosiers tried a couple of times to connect, but technology didn't play in his favor today. So nevertheless, we had a fantastic panel. I'm so grateful. As I said at the beginning, we were delighted to see that all of you, our idle list of panel members, you've all accepted. And we knew it would turn out to be a fantastic panel. Indeed, it was. And I can tell you the audience is also appreciative. I'm getting more notes of thanks and great panel. So thank you so much for your time, your thoughts, your wisdom today. I would also like to thank, of course, the CSPC 2020 for accepting our panel proposal and hosting, allowing us to host the panel today. I would be remiss if I didn't thank my colleagues within NRC who helped build this panel, in particular Katrina Oyong, who's in the background right now monitoring the questions, and Mardoché Toussaint as well, who's in the background. They're both in the background giving me virtual kicks in the shin, make sure that I follow the script. And finally, Christina Stachulak, a colleague at NRC, who initiated the thoughts around this panel. So with this, I think we're time to close. We're almost at time. Thank you so much. Thank you for the audience for being here and providing some very thoughtful questions. Have a great day. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.